I think in the interest of keeping everybody's time, we said we'd start at 1. I got 1 on at least 2 of the clocks I'm looking at. So we'll get started. Thank you for everyone joining us today. Hopefully all your families are safe and sound in this odd and unprecedented time that we're going through. We're glad that we could repurpose this presentation into a webinar as kind of advertised. It was originally prepared for the Michigan Safety Conference, and we would have been presenting this next Wednesday, but under the circumstances was canceled along with almost everything else in our lives right now. So I assume most of you from the comfort of your own homes will kind of kick back in our pajamas and bunny slippers and have a little talk about PFAS and what's going on. For those of you that don't know us, my name's Jeff Boland, and I'll be splitting time today with Matt Schroeder. I've been working in this environmental industry since 1980. Sometimes don't want to say that. It's scary when I think about it, but I've been with the Dragun Corporation for over 30 years. Matt's our senior environmental engineer. He started his career with us as an intern back in 1993, and has been with us since then. Together, Matt and I have worked for clients of all shapes and sizes, with problems from relatively simple all the way to litigation support and expert witness. Our intent today is to keep this presentation to about 40 minutes. We'll have some questions at the end of the presentation. And if you have a question, please email them to Alan Hahn or hahn@dragun.com, and Alan will bring those up at the end of the presentation so we can answer any questions at that time. And also, just as a kind of a side note, when the presentation was sent out, and we apologize, the names of the participants were kind of showing there, one of the drawbacks of working remotely, I guess. But if everybody would just please respect the confidentiality of those names, and be cognizant of that. So today we're going to talk about per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances, or PFAS, as it's, I guess, affectionately referred to. And I assume that those that have joined us today are either dealing with PFAS directly in your business or assisting your clients in dealing with PFAS in their business. And PFAS seems to have worked their way into almost every conversation these days. Yeah, imagine some of this will be a little bit of a review for some of the folks, but hopefully, we can bring some nuggets out during this from our experiences with clients, and that each of you can take away differently, because I think there's a number of us on here that are from different walks of life, and PFAS is playing a different role. We're going to talk about what we're seeing, again, from discussions with regulators that we're dealing with, trade groups that we deal with, clients that have had issues that we've helped them deal with or are in the process of helping them deal with, and discussions that we've had with our peers, both here and here in Michigan as well as elsewhere, because we do work across the country. And although PFAS have really become front page news over the last couple of years, they're certainly not new. Department of Defense, and probably more specifically the Air Force, started to look more deeply into PFAS relative to in the environment back in 2010. And from those investigations, military bases across the nation became a focus. And we started working with a client back in 2015 relative to a PFAS in groundwater, and that was an Air Force base, a former Air Force base, and now an operating airport following the closure of that base back in the 60s. When we first started getting involved in speaking engagements was, back a couple of years ago, where we spoke with the American Chemical Society at a bar in Detroit. They invited us in to talk with them. A little unnerving in some sense. We had PhD organic chemists in there talking about fluorinated chemistries, but it was, a good talk, and that's where we kind of started our discussion about this. And as you can see from this slide, it just only escalated with the explosion of interest from, not just the typical place you think you're going to see PFAS, but, Michigan Farm Radio, World Dairy Expo, a lot of other places outside of your typical manufacturing where we've been working with people that have PFAS in their lives. And with the unfortunate situation of today's world with COVID, it's probably the one time in the last couple of years that Steve Sliver, who's our executive director of MPART, hasn't been in the crosshairs. He's not front page news right now. And interestingly enough, too, just based on a blog we wrote, we were contacted to potentially testify in DC before the House on Science, Space, and Technology, but that would have happened a week ago, and that was canceled and postponed also. All of that said, emerging contaminants have been there. This isn't the first time we've had to go through this. Look at your time frame. Some of you, I believe, that are on the phone that I know have been in the business as long as I have, and pick your time frame. We've had an emerging contaminant that we've had to deal with, and that emerging contaminant side, basically, chemicals that we find in the environment that we don't fully understand the risks that they pose out there. And often, these what become contaminants, they're results of very well-intentioned, very useful chemistries and products, but when they're misused or mismanaged, get into the environment and have some detrimental effects to the human health and the environment. For example, I look at the one on the screen there with DDT, and DDT saved a lot of lives from malaria, but back in those days, it just seemed that, if a little was good, a lot must be better, and DDT was over applied, and it had some detrimental effects. And for all of us right now, PFAS have become that front page news, that emerging contaminant. And it's not really any different than those other contaminants, except that it was so much more pervasively used. There are a family of man-made chemicals that were initially created by 3M back in the 40s, and there are, give or take, some 5,000 of these compounds. Most of the focus to date has been around two of those compounds, PFOA and PFOS. And I would say stick with the acronyms, otherwise you need to continually try to say perfluorooctanoic acid and perfluorooctansulfonic acid. It's much easier to say PFOA, PFOS, or PFOA and PFOS. Now, that said, whether it's on the regulatory side, the focus is expanding, and the list of PFAS compounds that are being looked at is also expanding. Now, PFAS are an alkyl carbon chain bonded with fluorine atoms that have a functional head at either end, and that head side of it, the head and tail side of that chain, are what give PFAS the properties of why they're so useful in a lot of the products that they're used in. And this carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest bonds in nature. And as we go through the talk, we'll talk about why some of these nuances and specifics of this chemistry is so problematic. And as I said, so, why are PFAS so different? Well, as we go through our presentation, we'll get into some weeds, but just to highlight a couple of things, when I first started in this business, we were looking at part per million numbers for chemistry, getting into the part per billion a little bit. And, where it's gone now, our technology can detect lower and lower. And with PFAS, not only are we looking for them, but the toxicology that is out there, we're looking in the part per trillion ranges. And for perspective, I've heard a lot of different things out there, but a perspective that I like to use, I think it's a very good perspective, is that it's like looking at a grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, or a drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So that's a perspective of what we're trying to look at these compounds when we're testing for them. And one of the other things we'll get into is, again, the toxicity understanding is somewhat limited. The health effects that they are seeing and talking about are in the low part per trillion levels. And there's questions on the toxicity. But as we test more, we find PFAS in more and more places. And it plays to that widespread use of PFAS in our everyday lives. And again, we have very high profile sites with PFAS that have come to light, which gets a lot more community involvement and brings emotion into it, into the discussion, which sometimes makes it difficult. And there's already been some pretty healthy lawsuits out there with this particular chemistry. And back a year or two ago, DuPont settled for, I think, $671 million. 3M settled for $850 million. And so that garners a lot of attention relative to what's going on with PFAS. So it plays into a lot of different parts of the life. As I mentioned, this chlorinated chemistry is really exceptional properties. It stain resistance to both oils and waters. It's temperature resistant. It's a surfactant that reduces the surface tension of water. It's slippery and cuts down on friction. That makes it very useful in products that we use in our everyday lives. And as you can see from this slide, PFAS were used in many, many commercial products, ones that you have used and recognized in your everyday life. Scotchgard, Teflon, Gore-Tex. People, as they hear that, they think, okay, but then you start talking about sunscreen and dental floss and your food wrappers to keep grease from coming through. All those things where PFAS have been used, it's just pervasive and everywhere in our lives. For me, close to home a little bit is I've used fluorinated ski wax on my skis when in my large career as a beer league racer for years. It was the fast wax. If you had fluorinated wax, you were going a little faster. I also love my Gore-Tex. So we all, I think, have products that we use, that we love, and it was used in those. One of the things that started it all was the aqueous film forming foams, the AFFF that people talk about. It was used at military bases and airports, used in refineries and chemical manufacturers where they had to use this. It was the best product to put out petroleum related fires. And Matt will get into that a little more as he talks about it. They're looking at replacement chemistries for the PFO and the PFOS and using a lot of different fluorinateds, but with respect to AFFF, they're having trouble finding a chemistry that works as well. And why are they such a concern? I've talked about it a little bit, but because of their chemical properties, which are the reasons that we like them in our products, they're a bad actor when they get in the environment. Additionally, because they were used in so many products, they're showing up as a widespread contaminant in the environment. And while the toxicology is still being honed, there are some, known and perceived health effects. They can affect the growth, learning, and behavior of infants and some older children. They can lower a woman's chance of getting pregnant. They can interfere with the body's natural hormones and increase cholesterol levels, and they have been identified to increase the risk in certain cancers. They're also bioaccumulative. That is, in this case, they build up in proteins of people, plants, and animals. And here in Michigan, we've had some fish consumption advisories and even some deer advisories of not eating deer up around, in our case, Oscoda, Michigan, which is near the Ward Smith Air Force Base that has identified PFAS. And again, because of their great properties, for commercial use, they're mobile in the environment. They're mobile in water, including groundwater, and they're soluble, and they don't like to stick to the soil like some of the chemicals that we've had to deal with in the past. So they get out in front of some of the other plumes in groundwater. And because of that strong carbon-fluorine bond that I talked about, they're very, very persistent. They don't break down readily in the environment. And if you picked up a paper anywhere, they've been dubbed the forever chemical. And as Matt will get into, there's a mix of how the federal and state the federal government and the state governments are going about creating standards. It's a little bit all over the place. And this is a slide from Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Eagle. And I like to use it because I think it does a really good job of showing just what I was talking about, how PFAS can get from sources into the environment, and then how they get into the exposure pathways to either get to the fish, the animals, or the people. And if you look at this slide and follow the arrows from sources to a release to the environment and back to a receptor, it's a vicious circle. And it can be transported, as you look at these arrows, can be transported through a groundwater air deposition or a biosolid land application, and then the circle just starts over. Even when it's discharged to a wastewater treatment plant, because of the chemistry and current wastewater treatment plant operations, the PFAS typically are not treated. They're passed through that wastewater treatment plant, and they're either discharged into the water, or they adhere to the biosolid, and then the biosolids are either land applied, or they could be put in a landfill. Then it shows up in the landfill leachate. Leachate goes to the wastewater treatment plant, and the circle just kind of continues. So I think this is a really good slide that I've found of showing all the different ways that PFAS gets into our world and how we need to try to deal with it. So I've talked a little bit, but here's a list of some of the challenges of trying to deal with it. Matt's going to dig into these a little deeper. But just to highlight again, they're very, very ubiquitous because of the widespread use in products. It's been found in everybody's blood serum that's been tested. It's been found in all the oceans. It's been found in the Great Lakes. It's even been found in polar bears that are pretty far removed from your typical PFAS use. It's now being tested in shorter matter, but it's being tested by FDA in some foods and things. I understand the Environmental Working Group recently tested some milk, I believe, off the shelf. They found them to be non-detect, which is a very good thing. You can only imagine we're finding it in the environment and the emotions that are going on, but if we start to find it in our food sources, those emotions are just going to trigger higher. And the toxicology side of it, there's it's kind of still out there as to what the toxicology is saying. We've had some reports come out. They're a little bit inconclusive, but when you've got more than 5,000 PFAS and most of this work has been done on PFOA and PFOS, you know, and there's still disagreement about safe levels for those, you can only imagine the different views of what is appropriate toxicology. Accordingly, because we really don't have strong toxicological information, setting a standard is kind of all over the place too. And Matt will talk about that. But when you don't have a hard standard, what does that mean if you happen to find it in whatever media you're looking at? And there's some issues with, you know, PFAS that they don't necessarily completely degrade, but they do transform to other PFAS compounds, potentially more toxic and more mobile. I talk about testing and even trying to find an approved analytical method for anything other than drinking water, although there's a lot of development going on. There are very few approved analytical methods, so you got to be real careful when you get out there looking for it, and if you are going to test it. And when you are sampling, there's protocols to look at because it's so ubiquitous in our commercial environment. You have to be very careful of what you use to test for. Again, when I started my career in an environmental testing laboratory, we used Teflon a lot, Teflon tubing and Teflon probes. That was what you used so you wouldn't contaminate a product. Well, that's out the window for these. You have to use something other than Teflon. And you have to be careful of if you use certain repellents and things of that nature for insects when you're sampling. A lot of things that can play into challenges when you're dealing with PFAS. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of emotion and a lot of public concern, and you know, news coverage, depending on who's writing it and what side, has created a lot of emotional reaction. So sometimes we see the emotional side going ahead of the science side, and there's got to be a balancing act there, but that's certainly a big challenge. And with that, I'll let Matt jump into this a little deeper and let him take it from there.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory side of this, and then get into a little bit of the practical side about how you deal with PFAS if you do have it. So kind of what's happening at the federal level, we'll start there. Early in the 2000s, there was a voluntary phase out of PFOA and PFOS in particular in US manufacturing. So going back that far, they recognized that these compounds could be a problem. And then in 2009, EPA came out with drinking water health advisories for PFOA and PFOS of 400 and 200 parts per trillion respectively. So that goes back to 2009. Not enforceable, but an advisory. And then as the science got better in 2016, they updated that health advisory level to 70 parts per trillion for combined PFOA and PFOS. And that's the current advisory from EPA, although there's been a lot of push you'll hear about in a few minutes to update that science. In 2018, EPA got a lot of stakeholders together, more than 200 federal, state, and local leaders to discuss PFAS and the steps that we needed to take to address it. And they, at that time, had about 120,000 public comments that had been received with regard to PFAS. And that led to the 2019 issue of the EPA's PFAS action plan. And so this kind of laid out the goals for what EPA was going to do with respect to PFAS. And number one on that list was to address PFAS in drinking water. Also, they were looking to do more testing to identify where PFAS contamination is and then clean that up. So also monitor for PFAS in manufacturing to try and stop some of those sources of PFAS to our environment. and then also increase the funding for research. We've certainly seen a lot of research funded with specific regards to PFAS in the last couple of years. And then lastly, exercising some of their enforcement ability to try and get people who are the sources of the PFAS in the environment to clean it up. So because a lot of people were upset that there wasn't a lot of action actually being taken according to the PFAS action plan, we've seen quite a bit of legislation introduced to try and push that along. But very few of these bills really had any teeth to them. And the most effective means of forcing some action on PFAS happened when Congress included PFAS-related provisions in the funding authorization for the Department of Defense. And as part of this authorization, it said that DoD had to stop using fluorine-based foams by 2024 at all their sites. And Jeff mentioned that currently there's not an alternative for fluorine-based foams that works as well. And so there's a lot of concern that in an emergency, those seconds, could cost lives if the fire doesn't get extinguished. So they're looking into alternatives right now. There's nothing there yet, but there's a mandate that by 2024, they have to be using something else. They're also expanding the monitoring as part of this authorization. And you'll see a little later when I talk about some of Michigan's actions that, this additional data collection is really needed to define the extent of the problem. Prior to this authorization, PFAS had never been a reportable chemical under any of the environmental statutes. And within this regulation, PFAS is for the first time being reported under EPCRA, specifically under the TRI, Toxic Release Inventory. One of the issues with this is that because these are often a component at really low concentrations, they aren't really listed very well on safety data sheets for people to use that information for reporting. And when contacted, the manufacturers are often unwilling to provide the information, claiming confidential business information. And so it's really hard to get that information. My suspicion is that some of their reluctance to give the information up is also due to the proliferation of PFAS litigation. You'll hear a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So because there's no enforceable standard, many of the states have started enacting their own PFAS standards, and things are changing pretty rapidly in this frame. But what I show here on the screen is some of the more recently enacted or proposed PFAS standards. Still mostly PFOA and PFOS. And one of the interesting things about this is that although everyone is really using the same group of toxicity studies, there's a really wide disparity in how the data is being interpreted. And that's why you see different states landing at different spots with their proposed standards. There's very little consistency in what PFAS are being regulated other than PFOA and PFOS, and at what level. Ingestion is the main exposure concern. That's the main way that we can be affected by it. And so drinking water is the most commonly regulated medium, although surface water, particularly where it's used for drinking water, is also often regulated. We see surface water standards range from 10 parts per trillion to 300,000, and drinking water standards range from 10 to 1,000 parts per trillion. Most commonly, you see people adopting the US EPA health advisory level of 70 for PFOA and PFOS. So Michigan, we're going to use as an example because Michigan kind of got out in front of a lot of the states in what they're doing and also is fairly well funded. Michigan established a group called MPART, which stands for Michigan PFAS Action Response Team in 2018. And this group is from a multi-agency kind of task force that deals with Michigan's investigation and response to PFAS issues. So it's 7 different agencies, which you can see there at the top of the screen, and they've got a bunch of different topical work groups that we'll get into a little later. This group is led by a gentleman named Steve Sliver from Eagle, and Jeff actually had a conversation with him and has some recent updates on kind of where MPART is headed right now.
Yeah, in preparation for this, I called Steve. It's hard for me to remember what day it is. I called Steve on Tuesday and talked to him, and he was working out of his house. Uh, and Steve told me, he said they're still doing, trying to do the work that they were doing even under this COVID situation. But and they're doing some virtual town halls and recording those. They're doing town halls like we're doing this webinar, and then they're recording them so people can watch them in the future. But one of the things that I was really keyed in on was Michigan's ahead of the game in developing maximum contaminant levels. And they recently have put those into the legislative process. And I asked Steve if he thought what he thought was going to happen to that given COVID. Their intent was to have those approved as early as this month here in April. And he said regarding the MCLs, he's not sure whether they will be derailed with respect to timing because of the COVID. He anticipates they will. One of the things is they have to go through the regulatory process and through JCAR. And JCAR can basically just simply pass them on, or they can take them in under consideration. And if they don't just pass them along, they're required to be under consideration for 15 days that they are physically in session, as I understand it. So he thinks it's very unlikely in the real near term that those MCLs will come into play, but he thinks they will get passed. It's just a matter of when, given the situation that we have. Now, once passed, and we talked about this a little bit, once passed, they will have some significance in PFAS because it's going to expand the universe of PFAS in our state. Just on the drinking water side of things, he said they currently have 88 sites, and Matt's going to talk, but they currently have 88 sites that they've found PFAS in drinking water. There'll be another 36 sites on top of that as he's looked at what are being proposed as MCLs. So there's going to be some other drinking water systems that need to be addressed and go through the same larger process. And additionally, he said, hey, this is also going to trigger here in Michigan. If we establish an MCL, it plays into our Part 201 cleanup standards of groundwater, and it will become by default the cleanup standard under Part 201. So he said the number of sites that come under scrutiny under 201 or become a facility, quote unquote facility under Part 201 will likely increase and have more scrutiny. So, those were a couple of things that he was focused on, given the fact that what he's dealing with, but he's following the MCL big because it's going to make his job that much more. I'll give it back to you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So this is a little more detail on MPART's topical work groups. And although certainly the focus is drinking water, you can see many of the other areas where they're looking at how PFAS is affecting us. And so some of them are exposure-based, some of them are based on the sources, some of them are based on how we investigate for PFAS. And so a wide range of things, but I think this gives a little picture as to where the state agencies are looking as a whole. As I mentioned, Michigan was really focused on drinking water, and I think some of that focus is because of the issues with lead in the water at Flint not too long ago. So Michigan has a couple of high-profile sites that were identified early on as having PFAS impacts, in particular 2 military bases in Wurtsmith and Oscoda and Camp Grayling, and then the Wolverine Worldwide, which is a shoemaker in the Grand Rapids area that has a widespread PFAS problem. So Michigan gained funding a lot easier than some other states did to do their own investigation. And so thus far, they've tested about 2,500 drinking water supplies. And obviously, when they find impacts to the drinking water supplies, they're able to investigate the sources for those. And here you can see the results. So mostly green dots, which indicate non-detect, but certainly a few red dots, which are above the EPA health advisory, and then lots of yellow and orange dots, which are still places where PFAS were detected, just maybe not above that health advisory level. They also looked at the wastewater side of things. So Michigan required wastewater treatment plants through their industrial pretreatment permit program to test their effluent. And if they found PFAS in their effluent, they wanted them to look upstream to see who the sources of those are. Jeff mentioned that PFAS tend to pass through wastewater treatment plants and end up in their discharge or in their biosolids. And so they were really focused on getting the PFAS out of the wastewater such that it didn't end up going through the wastewater treatment plants and out into our surface water. So since no MCLs were really being established on the federal level, Michigan, as Jeff mentioned, has gone down the process to establish their own MCLs. And this is an interesting process because Michigan hasn't ever established their own MCLs. They've always just adopted the federal standards. But our governor set a really aggressive goal to develop these and establish them very quickly. MPART has a science advisory panel that they rely on that has some national experts that are used for technical questions. And in this case, they asked them what PFAS should be regulated and in drinking water and at what levels. And the report back from the science advisory panel said that the health advisory level from EPA of 70 parts per trillion may not be low enough, and that they should look outside of PFOA and PFOS at some other PFAS that they thought that there was enough tox data to support that they should be regulated also. I'll say that the process up until recently was moving on at lightning pace. As Jeff mentioned, I'm not sure if this COVID and working from home is going to slow that down, but certainly is faster pace than the federal MCL process by light years. So here's Michigan's list of proposed MCLs, and these values do come straight from the Science Advisory Board. And we've got 7 compounds on the list that range from 6 parts per trillion to 400,000 parts per trillion. 6 parts per trillion is the lowest that I've seen of any states proposed. And also you can see where you got some others in that same range, so 8 for PFOA, 16 for PFOS. Michigan passed this through the Environmental Review Committee in early March, and so that's kind of the next hurdle that it had to get over, and it's in the legislative process right now, and outside of the COVID issues was likely to become law in April or May. We'll see if that happens now. And Jeff touched on this a little bit, that although the MCLs apply strictly to drinking water, Michigan's cleanup statutes default for groundwater to these MCLs. So it's going to affect groundwater cleanups also. And these are certainly much lower than the current standards for groundwater cleanups. And there's still some debate on how these standards would apply to soil, but I think it's certainly the first step in the soil standards being established, and in particular for PFOS and PFOA coming down quite a bit also. So let's look at it from a little bit more of a practical aspect of how do you deal with PFAS if you have it. So for the wastewater side of things, because the target levels in wastewater are so low, in particular for PFOS, it's very difficult to remove PFAS from a system that's had it in it. The metal plating industry used PFOS-based mist suppressants for a long time. Most platers have switched to non-PFOS-based products a number of years ago, some of them as many as 10 years ago. And these industries are often still finding PFOS in their discharges, and many times the discharge limit, even up to 10 years later. So it's very difficult to remove. But the first step is obviously remove the products that contain the PFAS. From there, we see people cleaning tanks, pipes, wastewater treatment systems, trying to remove the residual PFAS that may be in the sediments or adhered to the walls of the tanks and pipes. Next step, a little more expensive, is to possibly think about replacing tanks that could have held PFAS solutions before. And then, we've even seen some people change to a closed loop system so that they're not discharging anymore and deal with it that way. And then lastly, probably the most expensive option is treatment of the discharge. That's obviously got a significant long-term cost to trying to remove the PFAS from a discharge. The other side of this is what happens if you have a legacy issue from releases of PFAS to either the groundwater, surface water, etc. We see it being more and more common for regulators to require some investigation if the facility has a history of PFAS use, and some states are even including PFAS in their regular groundwater monitoring programs. And as you know, PFAS analysis are not cheap. And with the low standards that are being passed, it's really difficult to find an exit ramp once you're in that monitoring loop. So first step is to investigate, you delineate the problem. A lot of times, if they've found that people are drinking water that has PFAS in it, they look at point of service treatment. So these would be treatment units, small ones that get put on the taps in a house. And often those are less expensive than a widespread remediation, but sometimes widespread remediation ends up being required. So if you do have to treat for PFAS, what are the methods? I would say the most commonly used method is granular activated carbon. That's been both house situations and larger situations with municipal treatment units and also groundwater remediation systems. Ion exchange is much the same technology where the PFAS adsorbs to a media, and ion exchange works better on some of the PFAS, especially the shorter chain ones, but it's often at a higher cost because the media is more costly than it is for carbon. Reverse osmosis is really effective for small flow rates. So in particular houses, you see a lot of them using RO systems. But then you have to deal with the concentrate because the PFAS gets concentrated into a smaller volume. So you have a higher strength PFAS waste stream that you have to deal with at the end of that. Really, the only destructive technology that is being widely implemented is incineration. There's lots of research being conducted to try and find other destructive methods, both for ex situ, so above the ground, and in situ, in the ground, ways that we might be able to deal with this in the future. But thus far, those are kind of all still in the research development stage and not really being widely commercially used. For soil, again, it's incineration that's being mostly used. Sometimes people have used a solvent to wash the PFAS out and then run it through some of the technologies I mentioned for water. And then sometimes it's being encapsulated and taken to a landfill. So most places are still focused on PFOA and PFOS, but when these were phased out, many of the chemicals that were used to replace them were still PFAS. For example, Gen X, you might have heard about in the news, that's the replacement chemical for PFOA that was used in Teflon. And then Adana is a name for a chemical that was used to replace PFOS in things like Scotchgard. And so while those aren't being regulated in most places, I don't think it's going to be long before we'll see a wider swath of PFAS being regulated, including those replacement compounds that are still in a lot of the products that we use. Wastewater treatment plants are another issue that I think is going to get more scrutiny. People who have been discharging to wastewater treatment plants for a long time may incur some liability from increased costs at the wastewater treatment plants due to their potentially not being able to dispose biosolids through land application anymore. Also from just higher treatment that they'll have to do to remove the PFAS, and that obviously has additional costs for the wastewater treatment plants. And then looking even further down than that, we've had a number of years where these wastewater treatment plants have been land applying, some of them with PFAS in their biosolids, and there could be some liability related to impacts from those biosolids on farms. Lastly, I think there's an unknown out there from air discharges to PFAS. There really isn't a lot of great knowledge about how these things act in an air deposition standpoint, but we've certainly seen in both the Chemours plants near West Virginia and North Carolina that these manufacturing plants have impacted surrounding communities through air discharges and air deposition of PFAS from their industries. So I mentioned a little earlier about litigation that's going on right now. And as the costs for PFAS investigation and responses mount, the states are looking to the manufacturers, especially to fund their efforts. And 3M, DuPont, and Chemours are the ones that are most often looked at as the ones that have been making the PFAS. Michigan filed a suit earlier this year that included not only those 3, but 14 other industries that either used or manufactured some type of PFAS. And just to put the dollars into perspective as far as what they're looking for, Minnesota filed a lawsuit for $4.5 billion and ended up settling with 3M for $850 million a few years ago. Michigan's lawsuit asserts that these manufacturers concealed the dangers of PFAS and continued to manufacture and distribute the PFAS, knowing that they would contaminate the natural resources and expose Michigan residents to harm. And one of the things I find interesting about this is Michigan and some of the other states aren't suing based on contamination in any particular site. They're basically just saying that you manufacturers, you knew that these were going to contaminate the environment. And so you should have to deal with all the problems that we have, not just any particular site. So just to bring this full circle, some of you may have seen last fall the movie Dark Waters that opened based on the issue in West Virginia near the Chemours plant. These types of stories and media exposure certainly flame the emotional reactions to PFAS. And we've talked a lot about the technical and regulatory challenges dealing with PFAS, but the emotional response certainly adds one more level of complexity to dealing with the issues when you have them.